Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Binance podcast. My name is Wei Zhou. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for Binance. So what I want to do with this show is to spend time talking to specialists, entrepreneurs, scholars, influencers, basically leading people from a variety of industries. Hopefully, through these conversations, we can share insights on how blockchain is changing not just these different industries, but also in changing the world. Here's a quick disclaimer. All opinions expressed by our host and our guests on this podcast are merely their own opinions. They do not imply any endorsements or opinions of their companies. You should not take these opinions as specific investment advice, as you will be solely responsible for your own investment.
Hey everybody, this is Wei. Finally back with another episode of the Binance podcast. What we're going to do for the next couple of episodes is actually, given that there's a lot of everyone, more than like 60-70% of the world is under quarantine, we're actually going to produce a lot of content that has tangential ties to sort of the coronavirus that's going around, the COVID-19 virus, and how it ties back into sort of each of the guests that we have on. And today, I'm really excited to have Carol Yin. Carol, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience? Because I think you're relatively known within the Twitter community with your coverage of China, and then maybe you can give a little bit about your background, and then we can get started from there.
Sounds good. So hello, everyone. My name is Carol. I right now tweet about COVID mostly on Twitter, and I host a podcast called Analyse Asia. Some of you might have heard it. And then I also make videos for Radii China. And you might have seen maybe one or two of the videos if you follow China and if you follow COVID on Twitter.
What's your Twitter handle, just so people know?
My Twitter handle is my English name, which is Carol, and then my Chinese name, which is spelled Yujia, Yujia, and my last name, which is Yin, Yin. It's a bit of a long one, but I think if you just search Carol Yin, Yin, my account should come up.
Great. Yeah.
So I am Chinese Canadian. I was first born in China and then immigrated to Toronto with my parents at the age of 10. Did my undergrad, my master's in Canada, and then returned to China afterwards and have been working in media as well as working as a freelance interpreter for the past 2 years.
And where are you physically based? Because it's a little bit weird for me to ask that, given that when people ask you where am I physically based, I'm just like, I'm everywhere. But I think at least sort of during the last few months.
During the last few months, or at least since last December, I've been mostly in Shanghai, and especially during the quarantine when China was really under a mandatory, self-quarantine at home. During that period, I was mostly in Shanghai, but I also, because my extended family, they're in a city called Wuxi, which is about a 50-minute bullet train ride away. So I also did a little bit of traveling between these two cities.
And how did you end up in China I guess you're from China and then you went to Toronto and then you ended up back in China. What was that process?
So ever since I left China as a child, I would come back to visit, every a couple of years, mostly during summer vacation. I'm sure a lot of, first or second generation, like Chinese Americans or Chinese Canadians or Chinese Australians, I don't know, they experience the same thing. And with my own eyes, I just saw my own little city, Wuxi, change so rapidly. Every time I come back, it's like a different place. And I was very much intrigued because those of you who know Toronto, it doesn't change that much. And so ever since I was probably in high school, I had the desire to come back and live and work in China to really, experience China beyond just a summer vacation. So that's why I ended up here. And also I did my master's in conference interpreting, actually. So that's interpreting between English and Mandarin Chinese, either simultaneously or consecutively. And I would be able to do more work in China as well.
Did you work in Toronto a little bit after you got your master's, or did you went back to China directly?
I went back to China directly, actually. And at that time, I didn't actually want to work as an interpreter because freelancing, you got to have a network first, right? So at that time, I was like, okay, I got to find a job. So I thought to myself, what is an industry that if I gained some work experience in, that if I wanted to return to North America in the future, I would still have a very valuable story experience to tell, so that's why I got into tech. So I worked a little bit at a VR AR startup. And then I started my journey in media. I was working at Pandaily for a while, helped to fund the Tech Bus China podcast. I was the editor for that podcast till I left Pandaily. Started making a lot of videos. I would go to, conferences like the Alibaba Cloud conference, Baidu, AI, et cetera, et cetera. And then that's when I started to freelance, and I do a lot of work in tech with, for example, investment firms looking into Chinese tech companies, et cetera.
Yeah, and can you tell us a little bit about Radii and Analyse Asia? Because I think some of our listeners probably don't know those two organizations or what they do.
Sure. So Analyse Asia was originally founded in Singapore by Bernard Young, who now works for Amazon Cloud Services. And we do a lot of interviews. We cover all of Asia, so not just China. We do a lot of interviews with, for example, funders, investors, people who work in tech or in media or in investment fields. And we focus on China is one of our focuses, also Singapore, also other parts of Southeast Asia as well. And we have episodes coming out pretty much once every 2 weeks. My latest episode that was released was my interview with Ray Ma, who co-hosts the Tech Buzz China podcast, and we talked about Bilibili, which is a Chinese video platform. And then I think the one before that was talking about COVID, because that's really what everyone wants to know about right now. And Radii was founded by Brian Wong, who is an executive at Alibaba Group. And Radii covers a lot of the more non-political stuff about China. So we cover culture, we cover music, we cover lifestyle, we cover really what's happening, what the millennials will be interested in, what people who are born in the 90s or the 2000s in China actually care about.
My background's a little bit similar. I think some of the listeners know that I was born in China as well. I was actually from Nanjing. And then
we're fairly close.
Fairly close. I don't know if you know Joyce Young. She and I actually went to the same elementary school in China.
What?
So we actually found that out during sort of our conversation just for the podcast.
That's so cool. That's super cool because on Analyse Asia, we actually had Joyce come on and talk about Binance.
That's interesting. Yeah, no, I think she covers it quite well. Although I think, but one of the things that's really, really interesting I find is that people sort of with our similar background is that we're actually in industries or in positions where we actually have good grasp of information and culture, both within China and within the US. What makes that really unique then is basically you can see a lot of businesses, but especially I think within the tech and the information and then tech and the investing industry that take advantage of that information arbitrage, I like to call it, or cultural arbitrage between China and the US. And that's probably kind of especially true within the crypto. I think that's where Joyce's, global coin, I think you should call it, actually is done a really good job in terms of bringing. And it seems like from your work, then you're actually creating a lot of content from China. I would assume the content is mostly in English for a Western audience to basically, to give them a better understanding of what's going on the ground in China, what's hot, what's popular, what's real, what's fake.
That's right.
You mentioned you started covering it or putting it out on Twitter. Has that response on Twitter shifted over time?
So, like I said, when I first started, I didn't really have an audience because I barely used Twitter before January. I would occasionally go on and share tweets about the newest episode for Analyze Asia. But other than that, I never really saw the point of Twitter, I guess. I'm more of like an Instagram a kind of a person. And so at the end of January, when all these news, like every day, there were just so much, every hour almost, I check Weibo and something else, a new policy or this new alert, etc. More patients getting diagnosed. There was just so much information. So I just started tweeting out information that I personally felt like the world should know. And in the beginning, I had at that point not even 100 followers on Twitter, but I just kept on going at it because, like I said, it was a way for me to share, like relieve my anxiety, to ease my anxiety. It's like, oh, I'm doing something useful. I'm sharing information with the world, kind of thing. And now I have a bit over 4,000. I mean, it's not a lot, but I still try to provide useful information, and I can see a lot of people, engaging with me. And there was a period in time when I felt a little bit overwhelmed, and I actually also tweeted about that. And I actually got a lot of personal messages from people telling me that, hey, thanks to all the tweets that you've been sending out over the past few months, I've, been very aware of the situation. And that has really helped me to prepare for what I'm going through now. I got quite a few messages like that. And that really made me feel like all the time that I put into, sharing all these information was really worth it, right? Because at the end of the day, it really is about people's like welfare, their livelihood, their well-being, etc.
How long were you stuck at home? Because I've had friends who are basically in Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou and Shenzhen that basically like 2 weeks ago was the first time they've been out of their house for about 2 months.
Right. So I was already in Wuxi with my grandparents when news from Wuhan broke out. So I was in Wuxi for a while, and then I went back to Shanghai. But when I was in Shanghai, I was pretty much home for, I would say, a bit over a month, but not necessarily up to 2 months. And within that time, I occasionally went out maybe like once or twice out of the compound to make videos for Radii. Like I did a street interviewing, people who deliver your food, and also sanitary workers on the street to get their take on.
So how did they enforce the quarantine then? Like, did you feel like were there police people on the street trying to make you stay at home? Or is it still mostly voluntary kind of people staying at home?
Yeah, it was mostly voluntary unless you came into contact with somebody who was already diagnosed. Then in that case, you're under like a mandatory one. But otherwise, really, it was voluntary. And most people stayed at home willingly. I mean, there were some measures to make, visiting other people difficult. For example, most people had to show this like pass to enter or leave the compound, the apartment compound that they lived in. And so if you didn't actually have one because you don't live there, then technically you can't go in, right? So the security guards, the person issuing it, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe it's the neighborhood committee. So 居委会. Neighborhood committee would come door to door. They would knock. They would ask you how many people live in your home. And then I said 2. So then they gave me 2 passes. But then there were no names. However, recently I saw friends posting their passes on Instagram. And I have a friend who lived in Beijing. He had his photo on his pass. So that's a lot more strict than how things were the way I experienced. How more strict than how I experienced it in Shanghai. So I think one point also is all the stories that I'm telling is not representative of China, right? It's just representative of my own personal experience, which I think a lot of people don't get when they see my videos or when they see my tweets. They're like, oh my God, look what's happening in China. And they feel like, oh, this entire country is just under like this one rule or something. Whereas it's really different municipalities are enforcing different rules. Sometimes in different districts.
So it's not like there's one central method that the entire country followed. It sounds like the country came up with like a general guideline, and it's basically left up to each cities even within the cities, different districts in terms of how to interpret and enforce some of these rules.
That's right. I remember when the different provinces first basically announced that they were in, I think, level 1 alert stage. I can't remember what it was called, but like the highest level of alert, right? Different provinces called or made that status claim at different times, because it really depends on how many people in your province are being infected, right? And so that's why measures are a little bit different.
The strictness of the quarantine measures basically is kind of semi-dependent on sort of the affected rates in your own like respective cities then.
Exactly. So, of course, Hubei had the most strict kind of measures, but there are other cities outside of Hubei as well. For example, I know certain cities in Zhejiang had a very high infection rate, high for Chinese standards, not for US standards these days. High, and then for example, the city of Wenzhou, and I don't know if they probably don't have this anymore, but for a certain period in time, there was a rule that for every apartment, so for every household, you would have the chance to send one person out of the home every 2 days to buy essentials. So that is a rule that's fairly strict that I haven't, I know certain Hubei cities, for example, like Huanggang, also enforce this rule, but it's definitely not prevalent.
No, I'm sorry, but overall in Shanghai, it's sort of like it seems a little bit more lax than as compared to some of the more heavily affected cities then.
I would say so. I think Shanghai was even more lax than Wuxi. Wuxi had in total probably less than, actually, I can't comment. I don't remember how many in total it had, but it was a very low percentage of the population and everybody recovered. No one died, according to official stats. And all restaurants were closed. All restaurants were closed for 2 months. Which is pretty drastic. But in Shanghai, I know a lot of malls did remain open, and a lot of hot pot restaurants remain open because I searched for them during the quarantine. And I can see on Dianping that they did take different quarantine measures that they advertised about, but they remain open. So it's different, really.
This is the first week of April now. So compared to the last week of January is, I think, when the quarantine measure starts. When did you start seeing Shanghai at least start opening up more?
Yeah, I can't give like an exact date, but I definitely felt people started to going to work more. I remember it was beginning or mid-March. Okay. I think it was at the end of February that a lot of people already started to go into their office for work, even if it was just 1 to 2 days per week instead of like 5 days, But in March, I started going to Radii office and we work out of a WeWork. And I could see that there are not a lot of people, but definitely different offices have opened within the WeWork office space.
What's the mask rate that you see?
Oh, 100%.
100%.
It's funny. People definitely have asked me this, and I have always been like baffled by the argument and the attitude difference as well. It was like, what? Because in China now, it's still pretty much 100% until probably an official word is out saying that, oh, you don't have to wear masks anymore. Because if you want to go inside subways, if you want to go on buses, any public spaces where there are like security guards in front, you have to have your mask on. And most of the time, you need to get your temperature checks still. This is 100% mandatory.
You mentioned that you kind of have been traveling a little bit in between Shanghai and Wuxi. Is travel open in China now? Or at least what level is open in terms of travel? And what level of how many people do you see a lot of people traveling?
Yeah. Because this weekend is tomb sweeping tomb sweeping day. It was on Saturday and it's a long weekend. So it's a Monday, but we have it off. So I actually am back in Wuxi again. And this time around, when I took the train, I first took it from Shanghai to Hangzhou and then from Hangzhou to Yixing station. it was like all the seats were full. But when I made one of the videos that kind of went viral on Twitter about, my movements being tracked, I made that video, I believe, sometime in February. And there were pretty much no one around me when I was traveling. So I think activities are really I feel like resumed to almost normal. People were, for example, I heard people complaining about how they were experiencing traffic jams on highways because highways are still toll free. And so during Qingming weekend, a lot of people are traveling, visiting relatives, going to places, and there are like traffic jams.
So it seems like things are starting to return to normal, which is basically becoming crowded again.
That's right. And I don't know if you've seen that post about Huangshan.
I saw that. We had 200,000 people or whatever number of people. I'm physically currently in Singapore now. And then the numbers in Singapore from February is actually relatively low, like 10, 20 a day. But then the last 2 weeks, sort of like a second wave, they call it, is coming. And they've actually had over 100 yesterday from the terms of diagnosed cases. So the country of Singapore is actually going to go on to the sort of lockdown starting tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
I think they've controlled it better than people have been. And then prior to that, people have been living normal. Like restaurants are open, bars are open. People are like chilling on beaches. So they haven't really suffered the people as much. But I do think that my advice is basically stay home. It's like, I think the only way to sort of spread this, to keep that from spreading, is actually just stay home. Mandatory is mandatory. But I think it's like, if people can do it more voluntarily, like wearing masks, and minimizing, I guess, minimizing social contact, ultimately, things can return to normal.
I didn't go out to eat at a restaurant for a good 2 months. Just everything was takeout. And so during that 2 months, I saw like nobody other than my boyfriend in person. Yeah, it was pretty wild, but it's not good on your sanity, but Google Hangout, all these other ways of socializing will keep you sane, hopefully. But I know I've said a lot about how things are returning to normal, but I just want to say that the Chinese government is still taking a very precautious approach. None of the movie theaters have opened, for example. Like they opened for a few days and then they were asked to all close again. And then schools haven't resumed yet. I was looking at different schedules of when classes were going to start. I think they are asking, the graduating class to start classes because it's a very important year for them. But other than, people who are in their last year of high school, most schools will not open till mid to end of April or till May. And I think in Beijing, that might even mean potentially schools won't be open for this semester, actually. And then, China has closed their border because there were so many cases coming in, like inbound cases. Most of the new cases are inbound cases. And so China is still being very, very careful, even though the number of new cases every day has been very low.
Why do you see big sort of numbers then, right, in Asian countries versus, say, specifically Western countries? Like the number of cases now. Because if you look at Asian countries, South Korea, I think, had a huge issue for a while, but then they were able to handle it. And some of the Southeast Asian countries, I think, has less of an issue versus sort of the Western countries. Is it a numbers game or is it just sort of like a culture thing?
I think you've definitely seen the mask and no mask grouping. On the graph, I'm talking about. I think that definitely has something to do with it. And then also because the proximity to China, right? So when things started happening in China, because these countries were physically so much closer, so I think they were scared. So they took a lot of measures early on. For example, Hong Kong was very timely with a lot of their responses. In fact, it was before January when they already sent experts, to China, and they had warnings to travelers about about going to Wuhan, etc. So so not necessarily regions that are close to China were very, very careful because of the proximity to China. Whereas I think if you physically were located in, say, Canada or the US, you feel like, oh, it's on the other side of the world. Like, it's not going to impact me. It was more like, oh, I'm watching what's happening, what's unfolding in China, not taking into the consideration that, hey, this is going to come very soon, like to here, where I am. And so even though, technically China did not, like, what was happening in China should have served as a huge warning sign. But I don't think a lot of the Western countries took it as seriously as they should have.
Yeah.
And then also, of course, there's no doubt that there's underreporting. We just don't know by how much. So I can't really comment on the numbers. Yeah.
Okay. I think one of the scariest thing about the virus is actually you can have it and you don't know it, and you're symptom free for like a period of time. And I think that's the scariest. So, and then you don't even know that you've had it until you get symptoms. And I think I've read somewhere that people can actually just stay symptom free, but then those are the quote unquote super transmitters that can actually infect a lot more people.
And so sometimes when people are like, oh, I'm not sick, why do I need to go into quarantine? Why should I wear a mask? Why should I do this? Why should I do that when I don't show symptoms? Like, that's not being very responsible to the people around you and to your society. Right. And I think what people in Asia have done that was a responsible thing is just wear a mask, right, when you go out, and just try not to go out as much as possible, and then try to stay home. Right. I think it's the greater the sense of a responsibility, right, to towards a society almost.
Anything that's sort of the other topical item that I kind of want to discuss with you, I'm not sure if you had a chance to talk to people about it, is actually the Luckin Coffee scandal, which has sort of hit the wire last week. Have you been following that at all or no?
I have been following it a little bit, especially because there are a lot of really good reports coming out from China, but only in Chinese. And I haven't seen any good articles or anything in English, actually. So I tweeted out a few articles that I thought were very insightful, gave a lot more details than what is being reported in mainstream media, basically. Like last night, I read an article that was produced by Ran Caijing. So it's a new platform formed by I can't remember the name of the finance group, and then Caijing Media, a pretty big Chinese news agency. And they did an exclusive interview with 5 employees of Luckin Coffee. 4 of them are still present employees, just talking about, certain like not warning signs, but things that they felt were very fishy during their time there. And these people held different posts. Some were like a store manager, and I think just different posts. And they shared a lot of very interesting details. Yeah, there have been a lot of writings in Chinese about Luckin Coffee, which I feel like I know a lot of people, for example, in the US, would really benefit from reading more of these reports. And this is, like you said, where, language arbitrage or cultural arbitrage comes in.
Yeah, that's the classic case of things did not smell right from day one. But I think people were chasing their money, that they completely forgot to sort of to try to acknowledge maybe there's something fishy, or the truth is not 100%. And,
right.
And I feel like that kind of exists within sort of the crypto community as well, that sometimes things are so good to be true that you're like, it's probably not true, but the price is rising. I'm going to see if I can take advantage of the situation.
Right. But it's hard, right? If, these are investors who live in the US, they've never had the chance to come to China to try a cup of Luckin Coffee, to actually, sit at the store or see the traffic, talk to locals who are the real customers of this business, then it's a little bit difficult for them to collect all the warning signs or very concrete evidence against what they are impulsed to do, for example.
And then from your perspective, then, do you feel you have an obligation then to sort of to bring that, from your position as a media person, right?
It just makes me, like, yesterday I was last night actually I was on Twitter, and I saw a lot of like, in my opinion, I feel like these are like some of these fake news that were getting a lot of likes, comments, retweets, etc. And there was so much hate between, West and China. It breaks my heart. It just makes me very upset reading or just seeing so much animosity between both sides, right? It pains me when I read nasty comments towards the US and other parts of the world on Weibo. And it also pains me when I read all these comments towards like Chinese people, the Chinese diaspora. And I think it's out of it's like almost like emotional response for me to want to share more positive, more objective news, or just more information, period. So people can, use their own judgment, just so that they can have more information to parse through almost, or get a more like a spectrum of news, right? Versus like, oh, you can only hear from like Chinese state media, and everyone automatically almost discredits anything they say, even though, hey, there might be some truth in the stuff that they're sharing. And then, or just having, New York Times, Washington Post, etc. They have their own biases too, right? So it's good to have more independent journalism, independent media, covering different topics, different aspects, or even just the same COVID topic from all these different angles. For example, there were a lot of discussions about wet markets, right? And I don't even think people have been to like Chinese wet market and they don't even know what that means, right? So people, a colleague and I from Radio, we recently went to a wet market in Shanghai, and we took our video cameras there so that people can see, hey, when you make comments about wet markets and saying that, all of these wet markets should be banned, should be closed down, this is what you're talking about. And most of these people don't actually know what they're talking about. So
they're just your local farmer's market.
That's right. That's right. But with like, granted, with, meat, more like, butcher shop is there and other seafood and stuff. But yeah, it's like your local farmer's market.
You should tell them that Walmart has been trying to bring the reason why Walmart's been successful in China is they try to bring the wet market experience into a shopping center.
I can see that, honestly.
I just think that for media in between China and the US, I think it's actually going to, how do you want to put it? It's going to get more heated, in my opinion. But I think just within that, I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of opportunity to basically, because I think the amount of information that's coming all from different industries is actually going to be all over the place. And there's going to be the need, I think, to interpret that and to understand that. And hopefully, invest and build your business around that. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening to the Binance podcast. And thank our guest, Carol, for joining us to share her experience dealing with COVID-19 from Shanghai and Wuxi. And I really hope that for everyone listening to, stay safe, stay home, social distance yourself, because when you're doing that, you're protecting not just yourself, but those around you as well. Take the time to, if you're bored, take the time. There are many things you can do online. You can start a Twitter. You can start documenting your life. You can start sharing some of that with your friends. Because I think when you do that, by staying busy, time does pass faster. And I think if we all take these precautionary measures, we can slow the spread of the disease. As we've sort of, learned with Carol here in Shanghai, at least, there is light at the end of the tunnel, but it is difficult. So my sincere heart goes out to everyone, and hope everyone stays safe during these difficult times.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. If you like this show, please share this episode on Twitter, Facebook, Telegram, WeChat, or any other social media platforms. Please don't forget to subscribe to the Binance podcast, and see you next time.